One of my favorite Sega-related series of games is the Streets of Rage, aka Bare Knuckle series, as you can probably deduce by the music that I've used to intro all 263 of these reviews so far on the channel. This probably isn't too surprising, as not only was I pretty vocal about my love for the original Genesis release back in episode 163, giving it 4 stars, but it's also the only series thus far where I've bent the rules a bit and reviewed a game that wasn't released for one of the 4 consoles that make up the foundation of this channel. You gotta understand, at that point I'd been waiting for Streets of Rage 4 for 16 years. So when it was finally released for modern consoles back in 2020, I simply had to do a review of it regardless of what platform it was on. And no, I don't plan on doing that again unless maybe we get Streets of Rage 5 in 2036 or something. Over the years, I've put an unknowable amount of hours into the 3 main editions of the series on the Genesis, but there's still 2 Streets of Rage games on the channel's schedule that I've never played before, at least until this week. And that would be the Master System versions of Streets of Rage and Streets of Rage 2, the latter of which I didn't even know existed until I started collecting for what would become this channel about 7 years ago. On the other hand, the subject of this week's review, the Master System version of Streets of Rage, I did know about, although as I've come to find out, I was wrong about what it actually was for all of these years. However, I should probably pause for a second, because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are possibly confused due to being in a tryptophan-induced coma from eating too many Thanksgiving leftovers. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm here to remind you that I'm not always smart enough to include something to make a joke about in the intro, so I have to rely on holiday tropes. You get what you pay for. Anyway, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. For those of you that have moved on to a non-poultry-based diet this last week, may I present to you the Master System Game Gear conundrum that most North Americans dealt with during that time. If you're not aware, the hardware in the Master System and Game Gear is very similar, with the Game Gear essentially being a portable Master System in much the same way that a Nomad is a portable Genesis. And before all the nerds out there start well-actualing that comment, yes, the Game Gear is technically different from the Master System, most notably in terms of display resolution, with the Game Gear's default resolution being smaller than the Master System due to having to fit everything into that whole 3.2-inch screen thing. But that doesn't change the fact that the consoles were so similar that there was a converter produced that allowed you to play Master System games on the Game Gear, and that many Game Gear games were simply Master System games running in a different resolution, or vice versa, as we saw previously with Quest for the Shaven Yak back in episode 211. The point is, for the most part, North Americans didn't feel too annoyed with not giving Master System releases past 1991 due to the fact that they were still releasing those same titles on the Game Gear. Except when they weren't. Confused, but not for turkey-related reasons this time? Well, I'll explain, but first, a look at this European package. And here's my copy of Streets of Rage for the Master System. This particular copy is in pretty decent shape, but it's definitely a copy that's been played before. There's minor blemishes here and there for the most part, and the hang tab has been removed. Pretty normal stuff. The only real odd thing is a chunk of the outer cover that's gone. Not sure what happened there, and I can only assume that it must have gotten damaged when they went to remove the hang tab. Thankfully though, even with that, the inner cover still looks great with no sun bleaching, water damage, or edge wear anywhere, even in that corner. With it being a European exclusive, if you want a copy for yourself, you'll have to import it, so expect to pay around $50 for one right now, and maybe a bit more for shipping. In looking at the cover, I think this is my favorite design era of the Master System. It's from the later formatting that is after the Master System 2 and Power Base Converter were released, as you can tell from the notes at the bottom of the package. But by this time, Sega was still retaining some of the classic tinges, like the action in the upper left-hand corner and the white crosshatched background, but now also having more advanced things, like the complete artwork in the center and the proper game logo at the bottom, and then even the full logo and art on the spine, which makes these my favorite Master System games to look at up on the shelf. As far as that art goes, it uses the artwork from the North American and European 16-bit versions, and that art has always underwhelmed me. Don't get me wrong, it's iconic, but has also always seemed like it was done by someone who had never actually seen the game in motion, and just had it described to them. Which is how you have Axel wearing a yellow top, which wouldn't happen until Streets of Rage 3, Blaze wearing what appears to be a more traditional white kung fu outfit, and then Adam, the best character, nowhere to be seen. To be clear, I don't mind the art, and it makes sense that they would just reuse what was used on the 16-bit version, but I've just always preferred the original bare-knuckle artwork from Japan, and I've even almost bought a Japanese copy of the game just because of how cool it looks. I might still, who knows. Flipping over the back, and we've got our standard later release panel formatting with language support for 7 languages? That's odd, it's usually 6 or 8. Anyway, the brief text does its job of selling the game and actually addresses one of my main concerns about this release that I'll discuss more in a bit. Along with that, the 4 screenshots included over to the side make the game look really good for a Master System port. I mean, just like what we saw with Road Rash previously, the screenshots here at least seem to show a game that looks very similar to its Genesis sibling. One last thing, I really like how even in 1993 they were still using the detail boxes on the rear cover that state how many levels, rounds there are in the game, and the number of players and supported controllers. Although, I really want to know how many people were still using a control stick by that time. Opening up the package, and as mentioned, you can tell this copy has been played due to the scratching on the cartridge and some slight wear to the manual, but everything is still intact. The manual has the dreaded split-page formatting, where all 7 languages are displayed at the same time, rather than getting their own sections. I understand why they do this, because it simplifies the graphic layout at the bottom, but I'm never going to like it. To that point, though, there are a lot of screenshots and pictures from the game included, so clearly they went through a decent amount of effort to put this together. Anyone who's played the Genesis version of Streets of Rage will be able to immediately pick this version up and play, minus one particular design choice that I'll get to in the review. So for those people, the manual isn't strictly necessary, but for everyone else, it's very helpful. Okay, that's the package. Let's get into the review and see what this unique port of Streets of Rage holds in store. So here's what I've danced around a bit so far. What we got in North America back in December of 1992 on the Game Gear is not the Master System version that I'm reviewing today. And I don't mean that it looks slightly different because it's running in a larger resolution or anything like that. It's actually a completely different port with some pretty big differences between the 2 versions. I'm not going to go into detail about all the changes between the 2 releases. Sega Lord X did a video detailing all that stuff if you want to know more. The whole point is, if you're like me and just assumed that they were the same game with just slight console-specific differences, you'd be wrong. You might also be wondering why I'm making a big deal about this. Well, it's actually pretty simple, but amongst all the differences and issues with the Game Gear port, the one that always never sat well with me was the fact that Adam was excluded from the game. Now, I get it. When you're creating a version of the game for a console that's not as powerful and that's going to be placed on ROM that's only half the size of the original, you're going to have to change things and possibly cut certain features. However, Adam was my favorite character from the Genesis version by far, so when I heard that the Game Gear port wasn't going to have him included, I more or less lost any interest that I might have had in that version of the game. Thankfully, Streets of Rage 2 and 3 on the Genesis were strong enough in other areas that Adam being removed from those titles as a playable character was something I could look at as just a mild annoyance. But an inferior version of the game and it didn't have my favorite character? Yeah, I was completely out. I'll be honest, leading up to this review, I was a bit worried about finally playing an 8-bit version of a game that I loved so much originally. I mean, I didn't really want to see Streets of Rage in this state, as I thought it might tarnish my memories of the game a bit. But then something completely unexpected happened. Well, I guess not completely unexpected, because I'm wrong literally all the time about things, but as it happens, I was wrong about the game I was getting ready to play. Being that it's not the same as the Game Gear port, a lot of the issues that were inherent in that version of the game are now fixed, and most importantly, Adam is back, and is available to play as, along with Axel and Blaze. After seeing that, any preconceived notions that I had about the game fell away, and it was time to really dig in and enjoy what Sega had come up with for this time around. Now, I should probably pause and set the background for the game a bit, in case you're one of the handful of people out there that don't know what Streets of Rage is. At the time, and the time being the early 90s, beat-em-ups were all the rage in the arcades, with companies like Capcom and Konami dominating the scene. There was just one problem. Capcom and Konami were locked into deals with Nintendo at the time, and they weren't legally allowed to produce games for other console manufacturers. So if Sega wanted to have one of their arcade games ported to the Genesis, they had to reverse engineer it and do it themselves via a licensing agreement with that company, which is actually how Ghouls and Ghosts, Mercs, and Strider came to be. And also, it should be noted that none of those games were released for the Super Nintendo. But when it came to beat-em-ups, Capcom's great white whale was Final Fight, and Capcom had decided that they were going to keep that game exclusive to the Super Nintendo for the time being. And yes, it would eventually be released for the Sega CD as well, and I promise I'll get around to reviewing that at some point. Sega needed their own gang-themed beat-em-up, and that's how Streets of Rage came to be, originally on the Genesis, actually making it to the market in the United States before Capcom was able to move Final Fight over from Japan on the Super Nintendo. The game was wildly popular because even if it wasn't quite as impressive graphically as Final Fight, it had a more complex, but still intuitive, control scheme, and a legendary soundtrack from Yuzo Koshiro. Okay, so now that we're all caught up on what Streets of Rage is, what about this Master System port? Well, the short version of the review is, this is Streets of Rage. And that might sound dumb to state, but what I mean by that is, the Master System version nearly perfectly replicates the Genesis original from a feel and content perspective, even though it's understandably presented in a lower fidelity. If you saw my review previously of the Master System version of Road Rash that I referred to in the intro, you would not be wrong to put them in the same bucket as far as overall quality is concerned. I mentioned Yuzo Koshiro's soundtrack from the Genesis version of the game because it's almost impossible to talk about Streets of Rage and not talk about him, and hearing Streets of Rage on the Master System was when I knew I was in for something special. Normally I don't discuss the sound until later in the review, but I think here it's critical to how well done this game is, and it's literally one of your first experiences as you boot up the game. As soon as I heard the first few notes play in the intro, I was immediately wondering how in the hell they'd pulled this off. It's not a perfect replication, of course, and as you play the game and listen to some of the other stage background music tracks, you'll be able to pick out imperfections pretty easily. But it feels far closer than what should technically be possible on the Master System. Keep in mind the Master System runs off of a PSG-based sound chip, and while yes, there are Master System games out there that have an alternate FM soundtrack that can be used if you have access to the FM Sound Module add-on, those games stopped being produced in 1989, coinciding with the death of the Master System in Japan, as the FM Sound Module was never released outside that region. So clearly, Streets of Rage is not using a FM-based soundtrack, as it's relying on that Texas Instruments-based SN76489 that dates all the way back to 1980. I'll be honest, I have no idea what's going on here. I don't know how they pulled it off, and I don't know if Yuzo was involved at all, or if he's just credited for his work on the original game, because unfortunately the Master System version didn't have room for credits. But what I do know is that Streets of Rage is probably the best sounding game that I've played on the Master System, period. But it doesn't stop there. Once you pick your jaw up off the floor from the soundtrack, you'll notice that the game looks remarkably like the Genesis version as well. Like the audio, it's not perfect, and there's some detail that's missing, and there's some graphical effects that have been removed, like the ship rolling on the waves in level 5, But all of the characters, enemies, weapons, and power-ups have made their way over to this version. The programmers clearly put time and effort into trying to make this game look as close to the original as possible, and it looks far better than the Game Gear version, so the time taken between those two releases was a good investment. Along with the graphics and sound, the control has been migrated over to the Master System in near perfect fashion. Anyone familiar with the Genesis version will be able to pick up and play this immediately, and considering that Streets of Rage was never intended to be just a button-mashing style beat-em-up, that's important. I was particularly impressed with two combat features that made their way over from the Genesis. The neck throw, which allows you to kick out at enemies when being grabbed from behind, as well as flipping the grabber over into a throw, and then the landing, which allows you to catch yourself when thrown to avoid taking damage. When I found myself in both situations in the game, muscle memory from all the years of playing the Genesis version took over, and I was able to pull off both moves flawlessly and without any practice on the Master System. However, even though everything so far has been glowing in comparison to the original game, there are a few issues that have to be mentioned. The first one is potentially major depending on your desired play situation. But unfortunately, to make the game work as well as it does, two-player mode had to be axed. For this version of the game, it's understandable why the sacrifice was made, but still, if you were looking forward to two-player beat-em-up action, you're going to need to stick with the 16-bit version. The reason why I say it's understandable that two-player mode was removed is because of the game's already limited availability of sprites. As you play through the game, you'll notice that you never fight more than two regular enemies at a time, or one boss character. This can lead to the game feeling slightly empty or even repetitive at times. With the game effectively being limited to 3 characters on screen at all times, if 2 of them were the players versus one computer opponent the entire time, that wouldn't be very much fun. Although I suppose this limit does lead to one interesting quirk, the 6th level boss, which formerly had you fighting 2 of the 4th level fire-breathing boss Big Ben, is now replaced with a new boss, the Penguin, who shares some similarities with Jet from Streets of Rage 2, because I guess the limited engine couldn't handle you and then 2 boss-sized characters on screen at the same time. There's 2 other issues that probably should be called out, and they're both related to the control scheme. The first one is how grappling works. In the Genesis version, if you grab someone, they're probably staying grabbed until you either attack or let go. In the Master System version, enemies tend to break away on their own, which prevents you from pulling off full attack combos. It's not a big deal, but it does change how you have to play, and you'll probably see in the video places where I just go straight to a grab and then backdrop, as I don't want to have to risk the enemy breaking away before I get to that. Related to this, I also saw people complain about hitboxes in this version of the game, and while I'll admit they're a bit less precise than the Genesis version, it's something that you get used to very quickly. The other issue with the controls is simply a physical problem. With Master System controllers only having 2 buttons, Sega decided that to trigger the Napalm special attack, you have to pause the game and then press either attack or jump. Of course, the Master System controllers don't have a pause button, which means that to perform a special attack, which oftentimes is being triggered because you're low on health and are in need of help now, you have to actually go and press a button on the console while you're in the middle of combat. This frankly sucks, and since it's a single player game, I really don't understand why Sega didn't at least give players the option to use one of the buttons on the second controller to pause or trigger the special attack, similar to how Wonder Boy 3 was designed. To wrap things up, Streets of Rage on the Master System is not perfect. However, even though it has some flaws, it still remains very, very, very good. To the point where there's times that I even have a hard time believing that I'm actually playing an 8-bit title. I mean, the NES couldn't dream of having a game that looks and sounds as good as Streets of Rage, and if you don't believe me, go give Mighty Final Fight a look, and you'll see that even though that is a great title as well, it's simply in a different class. Streets of Rage for the Master System far surpassed all of my expectations for what an 8-bit version of the game could be, and due to that, I'm giving it 4 stars. You could argue that I'm biased, and that due to some of its limitations, it should have no more than 3, but I'm sticking to my guns and declaring that this is simply one of the best games on the console, period. And that's it for Streets of Rage on the Master System. Sometimes on the channel I might mention hidden gems or possibly games that I have no expectations for and that end up completely surprising me in a good way. Streets of Rage definitely falls into that category for me, and maybe it's due to how poor I thought the Game Gear version was originally, who knows. But ultimately, it's one of the games that has made me really happy that I decided to do this channel, because otherwise I probably would have gone the rest of my life and not realized how good a job Sega did with this. It's really impressive stuff. Next time on the channel, it's a game that I can almost guarantee that I'm not going to like as much as this one. And that's okay, because if they were all 4-star games, then the rating system would be completely meaningless. From what I can tell though, this game is tangentially related to a game on the Genesis that I've previously reviewed, due to the fact that both games have the same name in Europe, just with that game being on the Mega Drive and this one being on the Master System. But apparently the games are actually very different. I guess I'll just have to put my best foot forward with this review to try to figure all this out. But the Master System game being different isn't necessarily a bad thing, because I didn't love the Genesis version. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 263. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.